greetings, friends, and welcome to the Gospel Underground Podcast. This is episode 32, in the Borderlands. We are broadcasting live, live for us from the Power of Change Worldwide Headquarters here in Blacksburg, Virginia. I'm here with my co-host, Jesse Fury.
What's up, Reed?
It's good to be back together, brother.
It's good to be back in the shed quarters. It's been a while.
Yeah, man. Jesse and I are a contrast right now in our appearances because Jesse has on a...
We need to start Facebook Living this.
We should, because this would be embarrassing for me, actually, because I'm in like a tattered gray hoodie that my brother gave me for Christmas like 10 years ago that I love. It's comfortable, but it's got looks like a dog bit on my sleeves.
Yeah.
And I look like I'm going to wrestling practice, and Jesse's got on like a leather sleeve patch cardigan, button down, hair back.
The sleeves are not leather. The patch is leather.
Oh,
a leather sleeved cardigan would be odd.
That you would look like one of the village people with that. With that on. What's been going on, man?
Oh man, just living the dream out in Radford. You know, we had that huge windstorm last week. Did you have any branches come down?
I was in Texas, man, so I don't
you
know.
Made Casey go out and cut him down.
Yeah, she probably was running a chainsaw. She's like the homesteader here.
we had like the top half of this giant tree break, get loose, fall 5 feet, and then dangle dangerously like a Final Destination
over your children's heads,
over the big swing we have on the tree that our children play on.
Wow.
So that's what's been going on in our life.
Did you climb the tree?
Oh no,
yeah,
it was like 50 feet up.
Good.
I mean, I could have done it, Reed, if I wanted to, but I didn't want to.
We have some trees on the side of the house here that have deposited like roots in one of the edge of our gutters. And so we were trying to think of how we're going to clean that. And we're like a 50-foot ladder. And I'm thinking, I'm going to pay someone.
That's what you hire someone to do.
Yeah. Well, there's a professor, a friend of mine named Bruce Ware, who years ago fell off a ladder cleaning his gutters and hurt his back really bad.
Yeah, that'll mess you up.
Yeah. And so I'm like, I'm not trying to go out like that. So
yeah, you don't want to go out cleaning gutters.
I just got back from Ohio, where I went to a funeral of a friend's father. Guy's dad was a pastor, and really, really powerful time, man. I was honored really to be there, listening to people talk about their father, husband, friend. Guy who retired. He was an elder. He was a business guy and retired. And then they needed a pastor, and for the last 5 years, he's kind of been their preaching, teaching pastor. And then in the last couple of years or so, dying of cancer. And one of the things that they shared was this, he preached, I guess, midsummer while, stage 4 cancer and everything, on life and death out of the book of Philippians. So basically they had the guy preach his own funeral service. They had a recording. His son edited it. I think our episode 33 is likely going to be talking about life and death here on the Underground. And we're going to let this guy preach to us. But it was moving, man. It was really, really moving.
I bet. Man.
So coming off of that, I was like, well, Lord, thank you for letting me be here.
Yeah.
Because I just felt like there was a true man of the Lord who, not living for the fame and lights of, American Christianity stuff, but just faithfully shepherding a people with the word, and even in his last few months, giving such a gift to all of us who were present.
Yeah, it reminds me of hearing that. Reminds me of the scene in C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce when he's in the paradise, starting to maybe become embodied a bit. He sees the woman, right, and she's surrounded by like this great train of people and animals, and she was like a nobody, as far as what the world saw, but God saw that she actually connected with and brought the gospel to so many people through her life. And hearing that, here's a guy who's probably doesn't have Twitter. And, and yet you got to experience the legacy and the investment that he made in people. Yeah,
it was really fantastic. It's a really good illustration from Lewis. The Napoleons of the world were kind of in the outer realms, far from God in the reality. Yeah, and the first will be last, the last will be first. The greatest in the kingdom, right, is the least. These kind of things sometimes break through our world that's so obsessed with celebrity and fame and popularity, and certainly the Christian church sometimes can get drunk with that mess as well.
Yep. So how else is your life going, Reed?
That's a big question, man.
People want to know.
I know they don't. Well, maybe they do. If you're listening in, you're probably our friends.
Yeah.
And so, we're kind of an interesting season. My wife, Casey, we've been married almost 23 years, and she's got a pretty significant surgery coming up on Monday, the 29th of October. She's a bit private, so I won't go into too much detail there, but she'll be in the hospital a couple days, and we're hopeful for a quick recovery and a smooth procedure. But I think she's a little nervous.
Sure.
But just a privilege, right, to walk with one another as sickness and health, you get older in life, and things become more meaningful. We tell young married couples this all the time, hey, stick through the hard days where you're headbutting and fighting about stupid stuff and go into the deeper years of the marriage covenant, because there is something that happens and forms that's significantly beautiful.
Amen. I agree.
Well, I'm going to transition now to a little reviewish segment, Jesse. And this is kind of an odd one, seeing we were talking about. Maybe not, actually. There's actually an interesting transition. This is a book reviewish that I wanted to do quickly from a book called AI, and that is Artificial Intelligence, AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order.
This sounds like a book you would read.
It's by a guy named Kai-Fu Lee, a very interesting gentleman who actually kind of straddles both cultures of America and China. He's the CEO of something called Sinovation Leaders, a leading kind of venture capital firm in China. But I believe he was born in Taiwan, raised in America, educated here, higher education, was very involved in software engineering, artificial intelligence. And he's worked for Google, Microsoft, Apple, a little bit of everybody. He's kind of like one of the gurus of the AI revolution. So it's kind of a interesting book where it starts out just like looking at artificial intelligence, what it is and what it isn't, which is really helpful because he gets rid of this idea that we're creating this like super, Skynet thing right now, which we really aren't. And then how learning systems and machines will actually be helpful to society, but has a devastating effect perhaps on the job market. Maybe going to put people out of work and he was kind of growing a bit like concerned and hopeless. And then the book takes a real kind of interesting turn where he comes down with stage 4 for lymphoma himself, cancer, which really kind of shook him, I think, to think about what it means to be human, that he'd kind of been leading his own life as a productivity and influence and impact algorithm. Like, how can I be the most awesome? And he comes to the conclusion that human beings are boiled down to kind of love and relationship. It seems like he has a Christian background, also kind of influenced by some Buddhist teachers, but very interesting. His suggestions for the future are going to be about what's most human about us. And he's like giving and receiving love. It's kind of like, wow, this is an engineer talking about love. So highly recommended, just to think about the future a little bit. I'm going to post on Power of Change here soon a critical book review of this book. And so be on the lookout for that.
Sounds good. I might have to snatch that when you're not looking on my way out of the...
Yeah, man, snatch it, because I read it in audiobook too, but this copy, you can grab it. It's pretty interesting stuff, and very human by Kai-Fu Lee. And that kind of transitions a little bit to our main topic today, where we're talking about culture itself. The Gospel Underground, we say that we're a dialogue taking place on the borderlands, right, between the church and culture. And this week I found, this is kind of a weird place, but I found a guy who's doing writing histories related to Borderlands, and he's got a little abstract of his research that was on oxfordbibliographies.com, which is strange. We'll put it in the show notes. But he had a really good definition for Borderlands that I think will help us when we're thinking about church and culture. And he said this: a borderland is both a place and a historiographic methodology, a method that historians use. Although historians often combine the two uses, a borderland, in its loosest definition, is a place where two entities, usually nations or societies, border one another. And as a methodology, borderland studies, I guess that's what we might be doing a little here on the Gospel Underground, question what happens when distinct societies rub against each other or contest lands in between. What do these situations tell us about both the core societies and the spaces in between? And I felt that was really a great definition for us, Jesse, because we're looking at two distinct entities: God, the people of God, those who are make up the world, and the various cultures. And then what do we learn about the world? What do we learn about ourselves as we interact, right, in these borderlands between the church and culture? You recently wrote a really good paper. I think if you put that on the bonhoefferhouse.com or .org yet, the paper you wrote on .com.
Yeah, but no, I have not, and I will today.
Okay.
That way we can kind of point to it, and actually I hope to next week put on a counterpart that has more to do with engaging culture.
Awesome.
So it's more of a, I took some time last year and did a little bit of like a biblical survey of culture. So what is culture? How can we understand the Bible story, the story of kind of Christian redemption through the lens of culture? And in that, and again, we'll link to that, but I came across some really interesting and helpful definitions of culture. One is sociologist Clifford Geertz, who is really just summarizing Max Weber, but he described culture this way, saying that believing that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun, I take culture to be those webs. So in other words, culture is the webs of significance and meaning that hold us together. But I think that's not maybe a full biblical picture of culture. That culture, the way I define it in the paper, is the way that we make sense of the world as we make something of the world. And so there's both this idea of we're creating and cultivating God's natural resources. We're making stuff.
Yeah. And his webs of significance is like around my house, there's like 100 million little spider webs, and each of those could be like its own little culture, right, where things are done a certain way there. I even this morning was thinking about the metaphor of a fog. If you're on the mountain and you're in a fog, there are certain things there that different people see, people don't see, but if you're in that fog, you're all in it together. And that culture itself, right, is something we're all in, right?
Yeah.
But yet we're creating it at the same time, right? That like I love the way you said that. It's like the way we make sense of our world, the way we see, and the way we make something of the world. And so when we use the term culture, it is kind of this amorphous kind of composition type idea. That it's made up of things we believe, the stories we write, the stories we tell, the films we make, the songs we sing, the things we love, the things we worship. And it's really hard to even calculate everything that makes up a culture, because within cultures there's subcultures and all sorts of things influencing us. But that doesn't mean that the fog isn't there if we don't see it all consciously or write papers on it. But certainly the world around us has a flow to it. We're in that river, both a part of it, and then as God's people, not a part of it, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So how would you classify like us being if you're a follower of Jesus, right? How do we see the world, right, that we create and inhabit?
Oh man, that's a big question. I want to first say yes to what you're saying. Like even the idea of water or fog reminds me of the commencement speech that David Foster Wallace gives at Kenyon College. Foster Wallace being a journalist and author, and academic who tragically died early. And in that he tells a story of the two fish swimming in water, and the older fish swims by and says, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" And they swim on for another 5 minutes before one of them looks at the other one and says, "What the hell's water?"
Yeah.
And really what he's saying is what you're saying, which is that the water is the culture. We live in a culture whether we see it or not.
Right.
We see through our culture. It affects the way that we see what we see. T.S. Eliot actually said that culture is a way of life. It's not just a collection of things. It's not just a bunch of activities. It's a way of life,
way of being in the world.
Yeah. So I said all that, and I don't think I answered your question at all. What did you ask me?
Yeah, that's really good. In terms of as a follower of Jesus, and according to the biblical narrative, right, the biblical story, the story maybe that shapes us, or more than anything else, the life we're at least attempting to live imperfectly, needing both repentance and faith. Should that narrative tell us that what is culture in that narrative, good, bad? What are some thoughts biblically, theologically
that's good.
on that?
Okay, so and again, I walk through this in my paper, but I think the way that I view culture Christianly is to say that culture is a good thing, right? God is the creator of culture
because He's made people.
He made people.
And people in context of creation make things.
That's right. And not only that, He makes people, He situates them in a place. Place is important to culture. He situates them in a place, and then he invites them to make meaning, right? He says, you can eat of any of these trees, but you can't eat this tree. And He's inviting them to actually try to make sense of that. How do I make sense of this? Do I trust God in His word to me, or do I distrust Him? He also invites them to make stuff, right? He says, make people, make created goods. He's inviting them into this.
Categorize it, classify it,
name the animals, understand, which it involves a kind of incarnational, like I'm in the flesh with these animals. In that first picture of naming the animals, I'm exercising both an authority and a closeness to them, and so He's inviting man to make things and to make sense, to make meaning, and really. In the fall in the story of the Bible is not just the fall of man. It's not just a rebellion of a person. It's a cultural failure.
Yeah.
Right. They have failed to receive God's word and make sense of it in the right ways.
To live out even their purpose.
That's right.
They twist the purpose for which God made us, put us in a world to cultivate and create, and then things go a little sideways. So culture is then the product of both something that's very good, human beings, but human beings that are kind of twisted and heading off in really wrong directions.
That's right. So now culture is, we're not looking for a culture-less paradise,
right.
Because culture will always be. There's culture in Revelation. There's culture in the new heavens and the new earth.
Because there is creation, there is culture and people in it. Yeah.
But culture has been bent and twisted. Some cultures are better than other cultures as far as representing God.
Yeah. See, that's an interesting thing, right? Because in our day, saying something like that, Jesse, some cultures are better than others. Right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying you said probably something that at like my kids' high school would be very controversial.
Right. Right. It would be.
What do you mean by better?
Yeah. So I think displaying true, just, good, beautiful things. Right.
Yeah.
So do we treat people made in the image of God with dignity and respect?
Yeah. The weak of society, how are they treated? With kindness, goodness. So there's even like a...
And by the way, can I I'm interrupting.
Yeah, you can.
I know I'm friends with plenty of people who are pretty strict cultural relativists.
Right.
But deep down, like if you press them off the record, they don't actually believe that all cultures are equal.
Right. You can actually get people to talk about stuff that pisses them off.
Yeah.
And they'll show you they're not cultural relativists.
Right.
Like you someone in the resistance, you mentioned the president's name, their head spins around and they're saying there's pure evil in the world. And then certainly those, and of a different perspective, you could do similar tricks
right.
too. I agree that there's a moral dimension, an alignment with goodness, right? That God has made, right? God has made the universe a place that has good and evil now, and we can accord with the purpose of God has made us, or not. Like years ago, there was a debate between an atheistic philosopher, Bertrand Russell, and a Jesuit priest, Father Copleston, where Copleston asked about the moral sense of the world, where he'd say something is better. He asked Russell, the atheist, how do you distinguish between good and bad? And Russell replied, the same way I distinguish between yellow and blue. And Copleston said, well, you distinguish yellow and blue by seeing. How do you distinguish good from bad? And Russell said, well, by feeling. What else? And of course the reply was, well, some cultures feel it's better to love their neighbors. Some feel it's better to eat them. Which do you prefer? So there are cultures perhaps that are better. Now, that should not provoke kind of a cultural superiority from anybody,
right?
But a humility and a desire to live submitted lives to God in light of His truth, and try to live in a just and good society and create one together.
That's right, and recognizing too that there's both special grace of God, and we would say there's revelation that we would want to see culture shaped by God's revealed word.
Yes.
There's also common grace. So this idea that God has given grace common to all mankind.
Causes the rain to fall on the evil
just
and the good, yeah.
And then I would say, and I think Peter Leithart has written on this, that there's maybe a third category where we would call it common grace now. Like you might look at some aspects of human rights.
Right.
But human rights worldwide, you could trace back in some ways to a Christian worldview of loving those less fortunate, right? Seeing the image of God in all of God's creatures. And so it's kind of a middle grace, right? It's common grace now, but it first came about through the person of Jesus being revealed.
Yeah. And by common grace, what we're meaning is that God's goodness shown to all peoples, not just kind of those who are in covenant with Him or His people, the church, but yet common. It reminds me of a phrase that I believe comes from Martin Luther, where he said he'd rather be governed by a benevolent Turk, and by that he meant a Turk, part of the Ottoman Empire, which was the most scary thing to Europe at the time when he was writing. He'd rather be governed by a benevolent Turk than by a wicked Christian in terms of common grace or shaping culture. Just because someone says they're part of Christianity or something doesn't necessarily make the systems, the things that they might want to create, good. Well, in terms of those two categories, creation and then in some ways being co-creators after our own creation, God has given us a task, right, to shape, subdue the earth, so to speak, and shape and cultivate it. We then, these two words, create culture and we inhabit it. What are some of the things that you see that we create that form cultures?
Yeah, that's good. So this is where I think when we think about creating culture, we are thinking about what philosophers would call artifacts. Right, so some of this would just be we make stuff, we make goods, we make art, we make music.
John Denver songs and hip hop songs and poetry and films and. Yeah.
That's right. From John Denver to hip hop.
Yeah.
Those are cultural artifacts.
Have you ever heard John Denver sung as hip hop? I have one time in Eastern Europe. It was country roads to a techno hip. It was actually more techno beat, and then the guy was trying to rap, and I couldn't sleep, and it was not a good night.
It doesn't sound like a good night. Yeah. So, but we would also think about creating culture even within, say, families, right? So family is probably the primary place of transmission of culture, creation of culture. We think of that too in church communities, in our workplaces. This is what Abraham Kuyper and the Kuyperian kind of tradition.
It was kind of a Dutch statesman, became, I think, president of the Netherlands. Maybe?
Yeah, prime minister, I think.
Minister,
and founded a newspaper, a political party.
Christian trade unions, all kind of things.
So this idea that God has given Jesus is sovereign over all, but then He's sort of kind of loaned out His sovereignty into different spheres who have the spheres being not just state and church, but also family. And if you work at Nationwide, at the office at Nationwide has its own little sphere there, and that a good society recognizes the God ordainedness to that, and so it works well when these spheres work well together, recognizing and not wanting to dominate each other, but wanting to influence within their own sphere, and
due to the fact that Nationwide is on your side, it probably has a pretty good culture. When you say,
we should be sponsored. We should be sponsored.
That was terrible. That was a dad joke, wasn't it? That was a dad joke. Sorry about that, friends. What do you think about? There's also, this is a word I want to use, inhabit.
Okay.
There's a lot of people, right, and of course ourselves too. We just kind of live in it. Sometimes subconsciously, unconsciously, uncritically. We're just kind of floating in the stream or sitting in the fogs ourselves. Is that good or bad? Does it depend? I mean, how do we can't escape it, right?
Right.
So what do we do in it?
Isn't there just sort of a certain amount of that you have to just be okay with? I'm asking you that.
Yeah,
You can't be aware of everything, and you can't change everything.
Yeah, it's like it's like in leadership, somebody who's hyper intentional about everything, right? There's certain things in cultures of organizations, churches, families that just happen.
Yeah.
That's why people say culture always trumps vision or conquers vision. You can talk all you want, but the culture of something, the stream floating along really does influence. I mean, we're speaking English, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We didn't think about that. Our brains absorb English from our mamas and daddies speaking it over us. And yeah, I think there is some that's just assumed. But there's some times though where we have to wake up.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. As a matter of fact, so one of the most influential books I've read on culture is by T.S. Eliot. He wrote it in, I think it's 1948. It's called Notes Toward a Definition of Culture. In it, he says this about this very thing. A society is in danger of disintegration when there's a lack of contact between people of different areas of activity. Now, between the political, the scientific, the artistic, the philosophical, the religious minds, you maybe could carry that on and say different ethnicities, different social strata. That really a culture at large,
tribes of certain interests,
which we're in that kind of world,
niche
right?
markets,
yeah. So when there's a stratification and a separation, a fracturing, that's a bad thing because different cultures actually expose blind spots in our own culture, help us to grow, and we can come alongside of and love people better when we actually are aware of our own blind spots and aware of things that are good in other cultures.
Right. There's nothing like a cross-cultural experience that's enjoyable and one that's extremely disturbing.
Yeah.
Because in both of those scenarios, we have just wonderful opportunities to learn or even self-examine, right? When someone from a different perspective calls out something that's wicked in your culture, it's time for repentance, which is a kindness and gift from God. And then certainly, like when you're involved in cross-cultural experiences that are enjoyable, right? You see the beauty of God's work amongst many different peoples, and you're not tribing yourself off quite as much as we typically do.
And it shapes you into a more virtuous person too, because you're more open for both recognizing God's beauty in other cultures and other people, but you're also you have more inputs into your own life.
So I would say that's one of the benefits of God making a multicultural world, right? And even continuing through the salvation of people from every nation, tribe into a new people and into a coming kingdom that'll be forever multicultural, I think is part of the beauty of it. But there's also a bit, because culture is created by fallen creatures, there's also a danger, right, to the fog, so to speak, or I don't know, this will be really geeky, nerdy sci-fi, but I think it was Star Trek The Next Generation had this entity called the Borg. And I love the Borg as a I guess you could call it a character. It's more like a collective. I think it's called the Borg Collective. And it was like this assimilating thing that kind of became this big hive of creatures. And I think that, the Borg would come along a civilization and say, resistance is futile, right? We will absorb your biological life and existence into our own. And basically you would just become part of the Borg. You didn't want to get Borged. It was bad, right? It's like, I don't want to become part of the Borg. And in culture,
you need to write a blog post on
the Borg Collective.
The Borg Collective.
Shout out to my friends at Jacob's Well who had too many Borg illustrations over 8 years of pulpit ministry. But the Borg, right? If you think of the Borg as a culture, there is this aspect where cultures that are ungodly, evil, will want to absorb our lives. In fact, when the Bible uses the term "do not love the world" or anything in the world, it's speaking of this dominating cultural reality that's at enmity or at war with God, that is not friendly to King Jesus, and will want to, hide your wives, hide your kids, because they're snatching everybody up in here. So there's an aspect that we have to resist culture, right? We have to resist, and there's a few concepts that I think are important when we think about resistance. And by resistance, I don't mean go to war with the culture or to create culture wars or just fight the culture. But in other words, we can't be dominated and captured by it. I like to think of safe harboring, ships who would find safe harbor from the storm, maybe in an island, lagoon. The raging storms won't destroy them if they find a safe. And our safe harbor is in Christ, right? In his people, in the community of God, right? And that community then, though, is in the culture, in the world. So it's kind of this, we withdraw into the Lord and each other without withdrawing from our influence and witness in the world. Now, there's a few books I was really helped with about kind of resistance thinking, and one of them was a book that I wish would get more tote in the world by a guy named Os Guinness. It's called Prophetic Untimeliness. It's a little small book, and the subtitle is A Challenge to the Idol, worshiping a false god, of relevance. In other words, when the church just simply tries to be relevant to the culture, right? Let's be more like the world so they'll think we're cool and come to our church. Always a bad idea. Right? Because then we deny our countercultural nature. We deny that the ruling king over us, who guides our affairs through his word and his spirit, is different than the world. Right? The world killed Jesus because they didn't like him. God raised him from the dead because he's the one who rules all things, and we follow him. And doing that, we're going to be different than the world. And that sometimes that's not always relevant. And Os Guinness wrote this book about prophetic untimeliness, meaning we have to speak a word from eternity in time and culture in order to actually have relevance forever on the earth to fulfill our purpose. But he introduces this concept that I believe he gets from C.S. Lewis called resistance thinking. And I love it. Here's how he describes it. Resistance thinking is a term adapted from a 1945 essay by C.S. Lewis on Christian apologetics. It is a way of thinking that balances the pursuit of relevance on the one hand, with a tenacious awareness of those elements of the Christian message that don't fit with any contemporary age on the other. Emphasize only the natural fit between the gospel and the spirit of our age, and we will have an easy, comfortable gospel that is closer to our own age than to the gospel. All answers to human aspirations, for example, hey, this makes life flourish, and no mention of self-denial or sacrifice. But if you emphasize the difficult, the obscure, and even the repellent themes of the gospel, certain that they too are relevant, even though we don't know how, we will remain true to the full gospel. And surprisingly, we will be relevant not only to our own generation, but also to the next, and to the next, and to the next. C.S. Lewis observed the same principle hold true in both faith and in science. Progress is made only into resisting material. Resistance thinking, then, is a way of relevance with faithfulness. And I think in our time, so many people chase relevance in culture and they lose faithfulness. Or if you only seek faithfulness without trying to connect and communicate in culture, you lose your influence and witness. And this resistance thinking is a way we might be able to balance both. And even when we think about our own kids, right, we're bringing them up in this world, right, 21st century North American context with a globalizing economy, technology, all these things, even we were talking about here on the Underground, Jesse. When you think about your own kids, what are some of the things about the culture that are maybe a little concerning or nerve-wracking or fearful to you and your wife?
Well, there's all kinds of things. From some things that may seem kind of benign, like a devaluing of friendship.
Yeah.
So that's one where I have over 1,000 friends.
Yeah. Quote unquote, right?
Yeah, but I mean, my kids will grow up thinking about, when they think of the word friend, they'll have a certain association that I didn't have growing up.
Right.
That I want to resist. I want to teach them to have good friends. I want to teach them how to be a good friend.
Yeah.
I think even just the whole social media, short attention span, devaluing of a person. I want to resist that.
It's the instant imaging of life rather than knowing deeply people's lives.
And even the autonomous self-meaning, kind of self-creating meaning. That's the water they're going to swim in growing up. And I really want to inoculate them against that. know enough of that to understand it, but that they receive their meaning from their maker and not from their own kind of
self-created micro tribe.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've created a world where we're known by our interests or our loves only, and then the other smaller groups we can gather around these things perhaps, and it does fracture us heavily into tribes where God wants us to have an identity as created creatures, as a son or daughter, both in family and covenant with Him, and in relationship with the world that both involves both loving the world like God does and then resisting the dominating aspect of the world like God would have us to do.
I want my kids to be a little bit weird. But attractive.
Yeah. Winsomely weird.
Yeah, that's right. In a way that what I mean attractive, I mean in a way that draws people in, that makes people want to spend time with them, but that is kind of head scratching to the surrounding culture.
Yeah, amen. You mentioned the word inoculation. I read this book years ago by he's I got multiple degrees in both mathematics, science, and theology. William Dembski. But he and a guy named Wesley Richards wrote a book called Apologetics, and they wrote this about inoculation. And this is something we really have wanted to do well with our kids because it takes wisdom, right? But he says this: the proper model for handling exposure to false ideas is not quarantine, but inoculation. Now, quarantine is like the goal of some Christian communities. Keep the big bad world away from us. Keep our kids away from everything, right? There's all kind of motives that people have just to avoid bad influences on our kids. And Dembski and Richards said that's not the good model for dealing with false teaching, false truths, bad culture. Not quarantine, but inoculation. And he goes on to say this: inoculation exposes a person to a disease, but in measured doses, so that the destructive effects of the disease are mitigated. The person inoculated against a disease ceases to be at risk, even when exposed to it. The inoculated individual is immune. Similarly, the student that has been inoculated against false ideas is far less likely to succumb to them in the student who has been cloistered away from them. Precisely because they have already been exposed to falsehood, inoculated students become convincing critics of falsehoods and defenders of the truth. For this reason, Christian apologetics needs to stress inoculation. And I think that's really good because we've seen this. Both of us have done some years in campus ministry in our past vocational pursuits. And I think both of us have probably seen kids who are trying to be kept from the world. Then they go off to a big college and all of a sudden their faith gets knocked around in a simple introduction to the New Testament or philosophy class by some, atheistic professor who's arrogant, who thinks he's really smarter than the whole world. But the Christian students hearing this stuff for the very first time ever, and then all of a sudden they're the cultural disease is all over them, whereas someone who's been taught to think about
they didn't get the flu shot.
They didn't get the flu shot. That's right.
They really didn't. They have no idea.
That's right. They had. I got the flu last year, and my kids have. I
thought you were going to die, Reed.
They told me I had the man flu as well, which is a different kind of flu. I actually had the strain of flu that was like actually killing folk. And I was seriously messed up, but then they were showing me these comedy videos about people that had the man flu, which is a guy who has the sniffles who thinks he's going to die. Because I guess this is true. Statistics bear it out, and there's been research on this that men typically get sick and deal with the flu poorly. But this is true. Like our kids, right, don't need to be quarantined from the world. They need to live in it with people who love them and trust them. And then to be taught about this idea is that when cultural relativism comes up in a class at school, parents need to be discussing those issues with clarity, rigor, and hopefully some skill so that kids don't get swept away by things like the various cultural diseases of our day, like loneliness, lack of friendship, some of the things you shared.
Yeah.
Well, D.A. Carson wrote a book not too long ago, maybe 10 years back, called Christ and Culture Revisited, where he just kind of looks at the way Christians over time have dealt with how do we live in and engage culture. And this is interesting because when you think about it, Jesse, this is a uniquely Christian thing because if you think about Jesus he actually taught us, right? Somebody asked him, hey, Jesus, this is a question maybe, so I think it's in like Matthew 21. Some of you maybe will hate this because it has to do with paying your taxes. But people are like, Jesus, I have to pay the IRS. Do you have to pay my taxes? And he said, well, give me that coin over there. And they give him a coin. He said, whose picture is on it? And the reply is, well, Caesar. And he says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, pay your taxes, and give to God what belongs to God. In doing that, Jesus clearly taught us, right? You can call it what you want, that there is the kingdom of God and there's a kingdom of this world. There are the spheres of culture on the earth, and there's also that which belongs to and ruled and reigned fully by God. Separation of church and state, right, doesn't come from Thomas Jefferson's speech to the Connecticut Baptists. It comes from this interaction in the Gospel of Matthew. And this is different, right, when you think of Christians and culture. Because, for instance, Islam. Islam actually is not a separating culture. There's no separation of church and state. Muhammad was a warlord, a political ruler, and the religious prophet and religious leader of the community. Islamic law is the law of the land in purely Islamic cultures, at least for the purists. Sharia law, the laws of God, why wouldn't you govern by these things? But for Christians throughout time, they've existed under many cultures, many political systems, and in many ways. All over the earth today, even, our sisters and brothers do that. And so Christians have had to think through, how do I relate to this world that our church is a part of, I go to work and I'm a part of. And D.A. Carson looks at different models that have been put forth over the years. One is fundamentalists. He's using that in the early 20th century American context, where the basic solution was, well, these universities are going crazy, this world is going crazy, we'll just pull out of the world. Kind of the move, we're going to create our own separate world altogether, sealed off from everybody. Martin Luther's vision of two kingdoms. One is a distorted world by sin and the fall, and should be and only can be governed by the law. And the other kingdom, the kingdom of God, is ruled by grace and governed by the gospel, right? And so we live in both, and so we have that tension. Mm-hmm. That's where Luther even gets into ethically. We got to choose the lesser two evils because we live in a fallen world. The third one Carson mentioned is Kuyperian, who obviously is referring to the sphere sovereignty. Jesus is sovereign of all, but he's given nationwide a certain culture, and his rule is expressed there. And then one that Carson mentioned was called minimalist expectations. And he quotes a lady named Frederica Matthews Green, and she compared culture to the weather. In other words, we have to have low expectations for our predictions of and our control over the weather. And so the culture of the world is chaotic, it's nutty. And so the focus that Green would say is to care for the individuals who are caught up in the storm. So if you're in the middle of a hurricane, you want to help folks. And Christians should be doing that, share the gospel, share redemption, see people saved in the midst of the chaos of the storm. Or the analogy I used earlier today, it's like a fog, and within it, we want to engage people there serving within the midst of the storm. But the weakness of that view is like you're focusing maybe on individuals and not on maybe making a more just society or systemic issues. That sort of like we should abolish slavery, for instance, that would make the world better and maybe calm some of the sinful storms. And then finally, Carson looked at some of the kind of post-Christendom perspective, because Christendom is kind of making Christianity the dominating cultural force in its institutions, which, if you look at the Gospels, Jesus is speaking to a people that aren't like the Roman emperor and how I'm going to bring a new Rome. And so now that, right, the church maybe isn't in power as it once was, say in Western civilization, people are thinking through various post-Christendom options. Certainly the Benedict option book has been offered as a form of, hey, how do we operate in this wasteland where we don't have power? Well, we have to build our own kind of countercultural institutions in the wasteland, so to speak. But that begs the question, well, but what about the people who are kind of getting wasted out there? How do we influence without power, right? Because that's a more difficult question. How does a church community that maybe doesn't have power engage the culture, or engage maybe people in culture? Because culture itself is just a amorphous thing, but people in culture, how do we engage there?
Yeah, I think that's I wonder, in the Carson book, does he address the Hauerwas, Yoder, Neo-Anabaptists at all?
Yeah,
Where
yes.
do they fall in
Yes.
there? Are they?
Yes, he does. I think it's a mitigating influence on power.
Okay.
Because the Anabaptist tradition comes out of even coming out of Roman Catholicism, coming out of Protestantism or magisterial Protestantism. The Anabaptists were still a small minority persecuted group, and so the influence would be kind of on the ground, so to speak, I would think.
Yeah, and interestingly, about what I found helpful, but I'm not quite sure what I think about it, is Tim Keller in Center Church.
Yeah.
He also addresses all of this and really pushes for there are parts of all of these to throw away, right?
Right. All the different models.
Yeah, all the models have flaws, but that's what the idea of centered church. He also carries that on to if you look at this as a grid and you think about what do each of these perspectives bring that's helpful, you can find kind of a centered model, which I find to be at least interesting.
Yeah, in fact, Carson's book, he says any model of engaging culture can't be totalitizing because they're time-based. I mean, they are speaking to a cultural moment, which will change. And so, when Constantine became a Christian, quote unquote, the church was in a different cultural moment than perhaps the time of the Puritans or certainly the church today in China, which is a growing influential force in the lives of the Chinese people, but yet a little bit of a threat to the government and somewhat controlled. And so if we think about, okay, we create culture, we inhabit it, some conscious, unconscious, we have to resist it. But we also have to engage people in it. So I love the quote here that I have. It says, Jesus had not called his people out of culture, but he had given them a new culture within the surrounding culture. That's a quote by Jesse Fury from your paper. I love that.
Yeah. So part of what I want to do there is show that, that there's and that may be two kingdoms, but essentially that the church, God's people, we are called to become a new culture. We are resident aliens to take Hauerwas's idea there. That really is pointing back to 1 Peter. We are a kingdom of priests, and so that there's we're not leaving the culture; we're within the culture.
Right.
Just as a resident alien is someone who's a sojourner but they become a part of the surrounding culture, but they still hold their own distinctives. It's a bit like we were talking before this about how when you're in more of an urban area, you've got Polish neighborhoods and Italian neighborhoods and German.
Lots of good food.
Yeah, and if I were to go for the right restaurants, and there's this sense in which within the broader culture, they're still enculturated in their maybe their ethnic heritage and in the best sense, there's a intermingling there. They're holding on to the important things while also kind of adjusting with the culture around them and influencing the culture around them. I think, I read James Hunter's To Change the World when it first came out. Yeah. And To Change the World is the title of the book.
Right.
And on the last page, he says, so I guess what I'm saying is
we really can't change
the world. You can't change the world. And but really what he was getting at is to take aim at changing culture or changing the world is really too broad of an aim.
Yeah.
What we need to do really it is to part of what I would say we need to do is recover a sense of vocation that God is calling us, and that's comprehensive. That's not just a job. That involves family, location, and that we are then to be faithful within there. It could be that we might be one of those special people that God uses in special. We might be William Wilberforce, but
or maybe just Jenny from the block.
But we're probably not, right? We're probably that pastor guy who passed away and nobody knows who he is.
Craig Malcolm,
there you go. And that really we can't. That's out of our control.
Yeah, I love that resident alien or that 1 Peter language, elect exiles, right?
Yeah,
chosen by God, from all the nations of the world to be foreigners in their own lands as we form a new culture. There's a great example of this in the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel, where people are literally conquered in war and taken captive, right, in exile, but yet they are they become influencers there in that society because they followed God. They did excellent in their education. And the fascinating thing when it says that Daniel was schooled in all the schools of the Chaldeans, which involved it was like the Harry Potter school for Babylonian wizards, man, right? But yet he was first in his class. Like, he knew how to say Mikkaliki Hi, Mikkahini Ho, and do the spells probably. He didn't believe any of it. He wasn't captured by any of it. His allegiance, when tested, remained with Yahweh, right?
That's right. Yeah, there's that sense in which that's still holding on to the good parts of the Yahweh culture of like, he's not going to bow down and worship the false gods.
He's going to pray as he normally
He's going
prays.
to pray when his
heart allegiance belonged. But yet he knew how to do the work in that kingdom and become a person that was in a place where he could influence for such a time that God might call them. And so I think that is a good path for us, that we are forming new countercultural communities living in the borderlands between the church and culture. So we need to be married. We need to make love. We need to have kids, be men and women, and what that means, certainly in our culture, is necessary. Do our work in our vocational callings. Engage in sports. Educate our children, even in hostile settings, being willing to suffer if called in our allegiances, trusting Jesus and being transformed by him. And those communities, we hope, formed from multiple peoples and multiple cultures, creating a transcultural community where the beauty and goodness of the human cultures that people bring as they become part of God's church will then be enfleshed together, where we learn and grow and display the glory of God to the nations and amongst the nations. I'm going to close with just a quote really quickly by C.S. Lewis, because a lot today there's a discussion of the systemic, the cultural systems and political systems, power structures that we create that can be either just or unjust, and the personal. And I think C.S. Lewis, far before his time, this is in the 1950s, I believe, was writing about how both are necessary. Transformation of human beings, individual people, and then they together working to form differences. But he kind of steers it towards the idea of good, of the good. He says, what is the good of telling ships how to steer so as to avoid collisions if, in fact, they are such crazy old tubs that they cannot be steered at all? What is it good for drawing up on paper rules for societal and social behavior if we know, in fact, that our greed, our cowardice, our ill temper, our self-conceit are going to prevent us from keeping them? I do not mean for a moment that we ought not think and think hard about improvements in our social and economic systems. What I do mean is that all that thinking will be mere moonshine. I think he just doesn't mean the drink in the mountains of Tennessee here. I think he just means like glitter that goes away. What I do mean is that all that thinking will become mere moonshine unless we realize that nothing but the courage and unselfishness of individuals is ever going to make any system work properly. It is easy enough to remove the particular kinds of graft or bullying that go on in the present system. But as long as men are twisters or bullies, they will find a new way of carrying out the old game under the new system. You cannot make men good by law, and without good men, you cannot have a good society. And I think that's a uniquely Christian perspective, that systems matter. Systems of social justice and economics matter, but also you cannot have a good system, a good culture, without men and women who are being transferred into virtuous men and women who won't just work a new system to their own greedy, selfish, and power-hunger means and ends. Any final thoughts as we think about something as spiderwebby and amorphous as culture?
Yeah, that was good from Lewis. And the one thing that I'm passionate about in the church is when Jesus in Matthew 16 says to go out into all the world, that is a call maybe primarily to different ethnic groups, ethnes, different peoples. But it's also, I teach it and think of it like a three-dimensional call. There's also another dimension to that to go out into all the world means to go out into the culture. It means that to go out into not just simply going out as missionaries, so that the only valid way to interpret that is for the church to send missionaries, but also that means that we're to go out into the supermarkets and into our jobs and into our neighborhoods, and really the church ought to be training people, not just ministers.
Amen.
And training people to have influence and lead and serve, and that influence should be an influence that gets below and loves our neighbor well. So I've got a passion to see the church embrace that. Like we're not going to change the culture, but we can see our neighborhoods transformed, our workplaces transformed by our love for our neighbor that is formed in us by Christ.
And then we create homes and communities where we'd want to invite people in.
Yeah.
When there is a storm raging or the fog is thick and people want to see the light of the truth in the face of Jesus Christ. I thought about that reading AI Superpowers by Kai-Fu Lee, when he realizes that in the face of his own mortality, when the storm of cancer visited his life, he realized what matters ultimately is love and relationship. And that's a clue, right, to the meaning and purpose of all things, because the universe itself is a personal place made by a personal God. And we were made for love in relationship with God and with one another, and form a culture of kindness, forgiveness, and grace, purchased by Jesus at great sacrifice to his own self, so that we might form communities of light that might point to his face. Well, thank you guys for joining us today for our discussion of culture. Please review us there on iTunes. 5 stars are acceptable, and they are growing. The Gospel Underground is a joint production of Power of Change and the Bonhoeffer House. Send your feedback, comments, questions about culture, things you might want us to take up here on the Underground to info@gospelunderground.org. We are a dialogue taking place in them borderlands between the church and culture, and we hope you see you out there. Peace.